Imagine a single seam opening in a fitted hide boot during an Ice Age winter. Snow finds the opening and slips inside. Body heat melts some of that snow. The lining turns damp, then wet. A wet boot pulls heat away from the foot far faster than a dry one. The foot cools, and the person slows down. Walking through deep snow with a cold, wet foot takes more effort than walking through deep snow alone. The group now faces choices, and none of them are free. They can slow the pace, share more food, stop for repairs, or let the problem quietly get worse. This is not a historical record. It is an illustration of how one failure can spread. In extreme cold, danger did not always arrive as a predator or a blizzard. Sometimes it arrived as something this small, a broken stitch. Yet Ice Age people left behind some genuinely strange-looking solutions. Structures built partly from mammoth bone, clothing sewn with needles carved from bone, bones deliberately smashed open after the obvious meat was gone. Dangerous animals brought down through distance and timing rather than strength. Fire preserved and perhaps sometimes carried instead of always recreated from nothing. Severely injured people surviving for years in ways that suggest sustained group support. Knowledge that outlived the person who first learned it. These look unrelated. A house, a needle, a broken bone, a fire, a scar, but each one helped protect something valuable and difficult to replace. The usual explanation says ancient humans survived because they were tougher. The real explanation begins when we stop treating survival as an individual contest. Ancient humans were not indestructible. They were vulnerable biological bodies, just as we are. They could become cold, wet, exhausted, hungry, injured, or sick. Not every population had identical cold tolerance, and researchers are careful not to claim otherwise. But no human body, then or now, could ignore prolonged exposure and simply keep going. Survival was not about enduring more punishment than the body was built for. It was about managing a connected system, even without anyone doing the math. Heat, calories, fuel, shelter, mobility, labor, group size, and knowledge were linked together. A good shelter lowered how much energy a body needed just to stay warm. Better fitted clothing lowered the cost of every trip outside. Stored food took pressure off the next hunt, especially if that hunt failed. Shared work gave an exhausted or injured person time to recover. Passed down knowledge meant fewer dangerous experiments had to be repeated. This video is not describing one tribe, one century, or one single Ice Age lifestyle. It pulls together examples from different times and peoples to show a shared human capacity. That capacity was the ability to stop one small problem from setting off several more. Picture a household with a limited daily budget, except nobody wrote the budget down. Heat, food, energy, daylight, fuel, repair time, healthy workers, and reliable information were all limited. They were also connected. The most effective methods did not solve only one problem. They protected several limited resources at once. And humans, frankly, were not naturally dressed for this climate. We are a fairly hairless animal with disappointingly little built-in insulation for the environments we kept entering. Picture a winter camp on a cold evening. One person repairs a torn seam. Another feeds a small fire. Someone prepares food from the day's hunt. Someone else hauls in fuel. 4 separate tasks serve one shared goal: keep the whole system running. The first resource under attack was the one leaking from every human body without stopping: heat. Shelter and clothing can be understood as the same basic problem solved at 2 different scales. Both controlled how heat, air, and moisture moved across a boundary. Natural caves and rock shelters offered ready-made protection. Some overhangs were cleared and reinforced with simple barriers. In more open country, groups built light-framed shelters covered with hides. Some shelters may also have been set partly into the ground to reduce exposure to wind. In parts of Eastern Europe, some Upper Paleolithic sites contain large quantities of mammoth bone. Researchers have interpreted some of those arrangements as structural. People used what the local landscape could provide. A mobile group needed shelter that could go up quickly and remain repairable. Transportable coverings, replaceable poles, and patchable materials suited that way of life. A group returning repeatedly to one productive location could invest in heavier frames and longer maintenance. Mammoth bone structures may illustrate that trade-off especially clearly. In wood-limited landscapes, large bones could provide substantial material where suitable timber was harder to obtain. Archaeologists remain cautious about how those bones were sourced. Hunting, scavenging, natural accumulation, or some combination may have contributed. The mix likely varied by site. Nobody is claiming that one mammoth simply became one complete house. The bones were material used by builders working with what was available. Clothing was heat control, scaled down to fit a body. Eyed bone needles found at multiple sites show that people were sewing, not merely draping loose hide around themselves. Sewing made it possible to shape garments closer to the body. It also made closures and separate footwear possible. A draped hide leaves broad openings. Closer-fitting clothing reduces the places where wind and snow can slip through. But fitted seams, like shelter walls, work only while they remain intact. That brings us back to the torn boot. Clothing remains a barrier only while the seam holds. The same principle applies to a shelter wall. Through trial and observation, people learn to slow something that never fully stops. Warmth keeps moving from a body into a colder world. They did not make winter warmer. They made it harder for their own warmth to leave. That lowered the energy a body burned just existing. But surviving winter still required enough energy coming in. That meant using far more of an animal than the obvious cuts of meat. A single large animal could provide far more than food. Depending on the species, one carcass could supply meat, fat, marrow, organs, hide, sinew, bone, and teeth or antler. Not every part was used at every site. That depended on local practice and what could realistically be preserved. Fat is a dense source of food energy. Marrow sits relatively protected inside long bones. That can make it harder to reach and slower to lose than exposed soft tissue. In an environment where calories were costly to obtain, dense energy sources were worth real effort. Archaeologists study fracture patterns and cut marks to reconstruct this kind of processing. The way a bone breaks can suggest deliberate percussion rather than accident. Even so, not every broken bone proves marrow extraction. Researchers weigh each case rather than assuming intent. Beyond food, the same carcass could keep giving. Hide could become clothing or shelter covering. Sinew could become thread and binding. Bone and antler could become needles, points, and other tools. Scraps and offcuts could become repair material. One difficult acquisition could solve problems that had nothing to do with hunger. Its value was not simply that the animal was large. One hard-won carcass could be stretched across food, clothing, tools, shelter, and repair. The useful sequence did not end when the meal was finished. A hide could be scraped, dried, cut, sewn, patched, and used again. Extending value over time mattered as much as extracting it. Depending on region and season, groups may have used natural freezing, caching, drying, smoking, or further processing. These methods could slow spoilage or spread use across more time. No single technique applied everywhere. Researchers are cautious about treating any one method as universal. It is worth admitting that this took considerably more work than choosing one convenient cut from a store. There was no boneless, skinless option on the Ice Age step. Making an animal valuable was only half the challenge. The other half was stopping the hunt from killing the hunters. Humans brought little natural equipment to a direct fight with Ice Age megafauna. We had no tearing claws, heavy armor, blinding speed, or massive teeth. The animals on the other side had weight, momentum, strength, and unpredictable movements when cornered, so ancient hunters mostly avoided fighting fair. Their goal was not to win an even contest. It was to make sure the contest was never even to begin with. The methods varied by region and period, but the basic logic remained consistent. Thrown spears and other projectile weapons could create distance from horns, hooves, and tusks. Spear throwers extended that reach further where the chronology supports their use. Ambush points, natural barriers, and narrow routes turned the landscape itself into a tool. Coordinated groups gave different people different roles. That reduced how much depended on one person's strength or luck. Distance reduced immediate danger. Terrain reduced the animal's options. Timing reduced the need for brute force. Planning reduced wasted pursuit. Coordination also reduced how much one mistake could endanger everyone nearby. This does not mean every herd hunting site belonged to the same population or era. The evidence spans different times and places and should not be flattened into one story. Ancient hunters did not become physically stronger than the animals they hunted. They became extremely committed to arranging the contest on worse terms for the animal. But a successful kill did not end the danger. It began a different kind of work. Butchering had to begin. Meat and useful materials had to be transported. Scavengers had to be kept away from the carcass. Weapons had to be repaired. Much of that work had to happen quickly in dangerous cold. A surplus meant little if the group lacked the hands and hours to process it. Distance and planning had protected the hunters. But another hard-won resource could not always be rebuilt easily from nothing. Fire. Fire did several jobs inside an Ice Age camp. It provided warmth and made cooking possible. It helped dry wet clothing and gear. It gave light through long winter nights. It may also have discouraged some animals from approaching closely. A hearth gave people a place to gather while skills and information moved between them. None of this made fire the single resource on which everything depended. It was one resource among several, and it solved several problems at once. The problem was that starting a fire from nothing was never guaranteed. It required suitable material, dry tinder, skill, time, and conditions that cooperated. In a snowstorm or after days of wet weather, none of those could be assumed. That is why keeping a fire going could matter as much as starting one. Some groups likely preserved embers or transported smoldering material between camps. Ethnographic comparisons from more recent cultures show why that could be practical. Direct archaeological proof of a specific transport method is harder to establish. What remains clear is the underlying logic. A maintained flame represented work that had already been done. Protecting it reduced how often the group had to pay that cost again from zero. There is a quieter idea inside this one. A flame can continue after the person who first lit it has moved on or died. Knowledge can work in much the same way. Fire was valuable partly because it could be lost. The people who knew how to protect or rebuild it were valuable for the same reason. A single person alone is fragile in a way that is easy to forget. Injury or illness could remove someone's ability to hunt or travel. Childbirth, exhaustion, or age could also limit what a person could safely do. A strategy built entirely around individual toughness would eventually fail everyone. Groups could spread that risk through food sharing and shared childcare. They could adjust work roles when someone was injured or exhausted. They could help carry materials or protect a person who needed time to recover. Most of those daily arrangements leave only faint archaeological traces. Some of the clearest evidence comes from injuries. Healed fractures and serious trauma show that some people survived long after the original injury. In cases of severe impairment, that survival can suggest sustained help from others. Researchers still avoid claiming certainty about the exact care or motives involved. A person who could not hunt might still repair tools or process hides. They might tend a fire, teach a skill, or remember a route. But it would be a mistake to reduce care entirely to usefulness. People were not valuable only because they could still perform a function. Groups may have supported vulnerable members for practical, social, emotional, or kinship reasons. Archaeology can gesture toward those reasons but rarely recover them fully. Picture an injured person seated near a hearth. They show a younger group member how to repair a tool or finish a stitch. That scene holds two truths at once. The first is care. The second is that knowledge can keep moving even when a body cannot. Keeping a person alive protected more than labor. It protected a relationship and a life. It also kept one injury from becoming a larger loss for children, relatives, and the wider group. In some cases, it could protect knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. That leads to the quietest survival method in this entire story. Some of the most valuable things a group possessed were not objects at all. Which route stayed passable? Where fuel could be found? When herds tended to move, which valley trapped dangerous wind? How to repair clothing? How to prepare a hide? How to identify useful stone? How to keep a fire alive? Which foods needed processing? Where water remained accessible. Later generations did not have to discover all of this again. That was the advantage. Knowledge could move through observation and imitation. It could move through direct demonstration, repetition, correction, and practice. Ritual and memorable storytelling may also have helped in some contexts. No single universal storytelling system explains all of this. Different groups almost certainly pass knowledge along in different ways. A good story could connect a place to a warning. It could connect a cause to a consequence. It could attach a lesson to a person worth remembering. Those connections could make life-saving information easier to recall and pass on reliably. Later generations did not need to invent every sewing method or shelter repair from scratch. They could begin with procedures that earlier people had already paid to discover. That price may have been repeated failure or real danger. This idea cultural transmission is a broad explanatory inference, not a transcript. It is supported by the complexity and persistence of certain technologies. Archaeology almost never preserves the exact words of the lesson. Here is the deeper version of the idea. A person could die while a solution they helped refine kept working. Fragile, short-lived bodies had built something more durable than any single body. They had built a tradition that outlasted them. But there was never one uniform Ice Age instruction manual followed everywhere. Knowledge often survived because it could be adapted rather than copied without change. The Ice Age was not one unchanging frozen world. Temperatures and landscapes shifted over spans far longer than any single human life. Eurasia alone contained forests, open tundra, dry steppe, mountains, coastlines, and river valleys. Different populations in different places and periods encountered very different resources. A solution that worked on open steppe might be useless in forest or coastal terrain. A method suited to one season might become costly or dangerous in another. Some groups moved frequently with food and the seasons. Others returned repeatedly to reliable locations. Some relied on caves. Some built open-air structures. Some had access to mammoth-bone, while many others did not. No single shelter, weapon, food source, or social arrangement explains how everyone survived. Even the same population could alter its behavior as weather, prey, or available materials changed. There was no universal blueprint. What connects these examples is flexible problem solving. It meant using materials the landscape actually offered. It meant reducing losses that were dangerous to sustain. It meant maintaining systems that already worked. It meant sharing risk and adapting inherited knowledge to new conditions. That underlying logic has not disappeared. It has grown enormous and mostly invisible. Insulation still limits heat loss. Refrigeration still limits food loss to spoilage. Medicine limits how much damage one injury is allowed to cause. Written records limit how much knowledge disappears with one person. Emergency services spread danger and labor across people who may never meet. Infrastructure does the same on an even larger scale. None of this means modern humans are weaker than Ice Age people. Modern systems are not the opposite of ancient survival strategies. They still prevent a small failure from becoming a chain of larger ones. They are the same collective capacity expanded to a scale that hides much of the work. Most modern survival is spread across systems too large to see all at once. Now return from that enormous system to the smallest object in this video, one repaired seam. Go back to the boot from the beginning, the torn seam, the snow finding its way inside. Now look at what could stand behind the repair of that single stitch. Someone had obtained and processed the hide. Someone had shaped a needle from bone. Someone had prepared thread strong enough to hold. The stitch itself had been learned and passed on. Fire, food sharing, and shelter could provide the time and safety needed for a cold weather repair. Experience had taught people what a wet foot could do in severe weather. None of that is visible when you look at one finished stitch. The repair may have been performed by one pair of hands, but the ability to make it belonged to a much larger chain of people and decisions. That is the real answer to what made these methods work. The strangest Ice Age survival method was not one house, weapon, meal, or flame. It was the ability to protect things that were genuinely difficult to replace. It protected heat and energy. It preserved materials and hard-won effort. It guarded safety, relationships, and knowledge. Ancient humans remained individually fragile. That part never disappeared. What became powerful was the system connecting them. Each generation could inherit a world that earlier generations had already begun to solve. Survival was never about how much loss one body could absorb. It depended on recognizing which small losses had to be stopped before they triggered much larger failures.